Hello, Jonathan and Jillian. This is probably going to be a shortish lecture. I think we've got time enough to get the last 20 years high points under our belts in the next couple of weeks. So I don't feel like I have to harangue you at enormous length. We've talked about the Afghan war. We've talked about the Iraq war. So now I'd like to talk about a few things in the 2000s that weren't related to the war on terror. More positive on the whole. We'll deal with the Great Recession of 2008 next time. But George W. Bush was elected president in the election of 2000. And I want to remind you about that. It's salutary for all American citizens. You guys will be voting in just a few years. To remember the chaos of 2000. And the chaos of 2000 came from the fact that this was an incredibly close election. It was an election, like the last one, where the popular vote and the winner of the presidency did not coincide. Al Gore, the vice president under Bill Clinton, was the Democratic nominee. George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, President 41, governor of Texas, was the Republican candidate. The election was close, but Al Gore won several 100,000 votes more than George Bush did nationally in the popular vote. But of course, we don't elect the presidents with popular vote. I mean, Hillary Clinton got 4.5 million more votes from Americans than Donald Trump did. He's president because of the same thing that elected George W. Bush, the Electoral College. And in all but one of our states, the winner of that state's popular vote wins all of that state's electoral votes. Pardon. So in 49 of our 50 states, you get every vote from the state if you win it by one vote. And that's very important to remember. So you win the Electoral College by racking up, how many is it? 328? I forget now. 235 electoral votes. And a few states for the last couple of decades, 3 decades, a few states have been absolutely pivotal. When you come right down to it, in the year 2020, 5 states are going to matter. You can, I think, safely assume, barring a total blowout election, that a Democrat's going to win the California vote, the Democrat's going to win New York, a Republican's going to win Texas. A Republican's going to win most of the Mountain West states. New Mexico and Arizona may be up in play, but most of them are going to go Republican in presidential election. So that, when it comes right down to it, Ohio is actually the state that has determined the president more than any other. But Florida has been in play for the last 30 years. So Ohio, Florida, West Virginia, and Wisconsin. Those are 4. In the last election, to pretty much everyone's shock, Michigan went for Donald Trump. Not by a lot, by I think it was 25,000 votes, but Michigan went for Trump. So this time, those are the 5 states to watch. That will determine who the next president is, in all likelihood. If a Democrat wins Texas, then it's going to be a massive blowout. If a Republican could win California or New York, it's going to be a massive blowout. But in normal elections, those are the 5 states. In any event, so election night 2000, we're all watching, and savvy people know which states to watch. And late, I was up, I want to say it was like 2:45, 3 in the morning, when Central Time, when they came on with a flash that all the states were pretty much decided. Ohio was very close, but they figured it was going for Bush. And that meant whoever won Florida was going to be the next president of the United States. And Florida's vote was razor thin. And it was way late in the morning, 5:30 or 6 a.m., when finally the last votes were reported in Florida. And George Bush won by, I think at that time it was in the neighborhood of 1,100 votes. 1,100. That's my precinct here in Texas is more than that many voters. That would be the margin to elect the next president of the United States. Well, when that projection came in, Al Gore called George Bush and conceded. But remember, a concession is a politeness. It has no legal significance whatsoever. And Bush came out and gave a very nice victory speech. Victory speeches in presidential elections, you haven't probably seen one yet, but they're supposed to hit a tone like, wow, we did great. You guys are great for supporting me. And I reach out to the guys on the other side. I'm your president too. We want to work together. That's what you do in a speech. And Bush did exactly that. It was a good speech. But by the time he got off the podium, Gore's campaign had called back. They were retracting their concession and asking for a recount. And that should have been figured. Oh, now that I think about it, I think it was like 1,700 votes. But that is such a tiny proportion. We're talking less than 1/100th of 1% of the total votes cast in Florida. That one could easily imagine mistakes in counting. So they had to have a recount to know who the president was going to be. And as the recount got going, it soon became apparent. The first thing you do in Florida and many other states is you run the ballots through the counters again. This was before computerized voting in most places. You still had paper ballots of different kinds in different Florida counties. And they had to recount the paper ballots mechanically. There are machines you feed them into and they count up. And when they counted up mechanically a second time, Bush's margin of victory shrank to half of what it had been. He still had more votes, but it had knocked off something like 1,000 of those 1,700 votes in the mechanical recount. Well, understandably, Al Gore said, hey, if I could get that many votes on a recount with machines, surely it's worth counting with human beings, which is the second thing that happens in a recount in Florida. Teams of 3 election judges have to physically look at each paper ballot and determine the intent of the voter. That's what their law said. Makes sense. So these 3 people, and if there's a disagreement, it's a vote 2-1, which way to count the ballot. And it's the intent of the voter. Now, in most Florida counties, they were then using what was called a butterfly ballot. You took a kind of punch card, pardon me, poked it down inside a booklet, and then you turn the pages of the booklet and it would show you the names of the candidates, and you would punch with a stylus through the card next to the name of your candidate. The cards were stiff paper, but it wasn't incredibly difficult to poke your stylus through. It was a pointy piece of metal. You didn't have to push hard to get it through, but you had to apply a little pressure to get it through. Well, those butterfly ballots proved to be a nightmare. The pieces of paper that were supposed to punch out when you use a stylus are called chads. And goodness gracious, the country sat for weeks watching these teams of voting judges looking and arguing about chads. And in Florida, one election judge was a Republican, one election judge was a Democrat, and one was an independent. And so you can imagine that if there was any possible way to argue about it, which side was going to argue for what, right? And it turned out that, Florida has a lot of retirees that live there, a lot of elderly people. And apparently some of them didn't understand that, you had to poke all the way through the paper. So they push and it would make a dimple in the paper, but it wouldn't poke out the chad. These became known as dimpled chads. Now, the idea on the machine was that it was supposed to poke that chad out so it'd fall out of the ballot. But there was also what were called hanging chads, where the thing poked through and made a hole, but it didn't come off. Now, that wasn't very difficult. If it was a hanging chad, it was pretty easy to tell who they wanted to vote for. So those didn't get too much argument. But these dimpled chads, you had people with magnifying glasses and high-powered lights looking sideways, trying to see, is there a dimple in that? Or did they just not vote for president at all? And you got huge arguments about that. Anyway, the final recount came in, and it looked like the Secretary of State, who was a Republican official in Florida, had to certify the results of the recount. And she was going to certify George Bush winning by a little more than 500 votes. So it shrank yet again, but not enough to give the state to Al Gore. So she was going to certify, and then Al Gore sued, saying the procedures used in a couple of counties had not been done right, and that it would be denying people their due process of law and equal protection under the 14th Amendment to certify it. That claim went to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta, and then to the United States Supreme Court. Bush versus Gore, the United States Supreme Court heard the arguments. It wasn't televised live, but it was played on the radio live with video footage that showed later. And the country was on pins and needles, because if the Supreme Court sided with the Bush campaign, George Bush would be our president. If they sided with the Gore campaign, we might have yet another recount to go through, and who knows what was going to happen. The Supreme Court sided with the Bush campaign, and the Gore decided that was it. There wasn't any need to fight anymore. There were some arguments about Ohio and other things that people had been making, but he said, oh, forget it. And we're talking about, it was well into December by now. We'd been going through this way over a month when finally Bush v. Gore, the Supreme Court, effectively determined who the president was going to be, which is not good. Nobody liked that. And of course, there was talk about the Electoral College should be gotten rid of and all that, because, Gore won the popular vote, but he's not going to be president. And we've had that happen a couple of times since. There's always talk. It will not happen, by the way. The Electoral College is going nowhere, because you'd have to get 3/4 of the states to agree, and the Republicans have won the presidency twice without winning the popular vote, so they're not going to agree to get rid of the Electoral College. You can never get 3/4 of the states, even if you get it through Congress. So don't get your hopes up somehow the Electoral College is going anywhere. It is not going anywhere anytime soon. So that's how we'll be electing our presidents, I'm sure, deep into your lifetime, probably your whole life. But there you go. That was worth a lecture, I think. We're at 13 minutes. I'll stop there. That is how George Bush became president, the debacle of that. Now, one of the outcomes of this was trying to get away from those kind of paper ballots. So we had a rapid development of computerized voting systems. But then, as the 2000s wore on, it became more and more clear that the internet meant that everything is now connected. Whether you think it is or not, hackers can get into it. And so we had a kind of backlash that eventually developed. Everybody went computerized everything right after 2000. And then we began backtracking and saying, hey, we need a paper trail. And maybe we should just get rid of computers altogether and start marking our ballots. In Britain, they still do that, by the way. They're paper ballots, and you put a big X next to the person you want to win. And they count them, and somehow they get done in the same night. I mean, I think it sounds like a good idea to me, but anyway. Just wanted to highlight all that for you guys. Lord only knows how the election of 2020 is going to go. There'll be mail-in ballots in many states. Other states are adamant that that's not safe and people could cheat by mail-in ballots. Who knows how this is all going to play out this year? The coronavirus scare, will it be around in November? Will people be afraid to vote? I can't even begin to tell you. But it's going to be an interesting election. Take care, guys.